Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. I'll be doing a series over the next few weeks called Upside Down, and this is the time of the year where we try to give Steve a little bit of time off, time to recoup, and just take some time for himself. So I appreciate that fact, and it gives me a chance to take a stab at this whole preaching thing, so I just appreciate your cooperation with that. I have to admit, one of these times I'm just going to come up and I have to explain all that because people kind of freak out and they're like, where's Steve? So I have to make sure just everybody calm down. But seriously, one of these times I'm just going to walk, I'm going to go, Steve didn't make it. And just start preaching. No explanation whatsoever. Just dive right in. But I don't want to get fired. So I'm not going to do that. We are going to be talking about a part of Scripture called the Sermon on the Mount. And this is where Jesus, this is his longest recorded sermon, where he's speaking to the people, and he really talks about some things that take people in a very different direction, different than what the culture around them had been teaching them for hundreds of years, really. And they had gotten so far away from the core teachings of what God had given them that they had just kind of gone off on all these other tangents. And so Jesus is just trying to pull them back in and just trying to explain this is what the Scriptures say and this is how you apply them. And so what we'll be talking about is, first of all, and we won't be doing the whole sermon, obviously. We're going to talk about certain parts. And I kind of thought about dividing these two parts today that I'll be covering separately, but I really want to talk about our thoughts and how our thoughts can be just as destructive as our actions. And two areas that he covers is anger and lust. Anger and lust. And I don't know about you, but I struggle, and we struggle with both of these things. And I especially have struggles with anger. And I think that we all do. That's something that we all have past hurts, pains, resentments, scars, whatever you want to call them. We are all dealing with these on some level. I actually brought this up to a connection group that I was leading not too long ago, and I said, do you remember that time? And for those of you that are parents, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you that are parents, do you remember when you were trying to choose a name for your child? And both of you had a short list of names that you refused to name your child because they reminded you of someone who was absolutely horrible. They were horrible people, and you're like, we will not do that. And it was one of the first conversations that you had. It was like, we're pregnant. Yay! What are we going to name her? Not Susan. And then you have to go and do the whole thing about why not Susan? Why not Susan? I knew it was Susan. She was a soul-sucking demon. She made fourth grade very difficult for me. And we will name her Adolf before we name her Susan. And we have these things that we have just held on to sometimes for decades, and we can't let them go. And so we just all have these areas that we're working on, and Jesus is talking to the people, and he's talking to them in a way that this was a new teaching for them. This is how you apply these things, because your thoughts are just as destructive as your actions. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in, and this is coming from Matthew 5, verse 21, is where we'll be starting. Matthew 5, 21. There's notes in your bulletin. We also have some Bibles passed out that you can look in your phone as well, and you can scan that code at the bottom of the notes if you want to go to. I've got a Google Doc with these things on there as well. But we're just going to walk through the passage first, and then we're just going to pull some insights that I feel kind of overlap these two subjects that Jesus is talking about. Okay? So, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. Okay? So during Jesus' day, and we're just going to walk through this a little bit at a time. During Jesus' day, they had the same thinking that we do. Hey, you know what? I haven't killed anybody. I haven't cheated on my spouse. I don't beat my kids. I'm a great person. I'm doing really well in life. And so they set the bar very, very low. And they had that same kind of thinking. Well, if I don't do these huge things, then really I'm doing all right. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. And let me go ahead and tell you what I'm referring to, or I'm sorry, what he is referring to, and that is unjustified anger. Okay? Unjustified anger. There are times where anger is justified. In fact, there's a lot of things going on in this world because Christians don't get angry enough. But we are talking about unjustified anger. The kind that is talked about, and if this isn't in your notes, but if you look at Colossians 3:8, Paul talks about how, but now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, and dirty language. Don't lie to each other. That kind of language, just that hateful, destructive kind of hate. And he goes on to say, if you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. And so judgment came from, if you killed somebody, judgment came from two directions. You had judgment from a human court. They would exact a judgment of some kind and a sentence. And then, of course, there was a judgment from God as well. And what he is saying is if you have this hatred just lingering and building inside you, you are worthy of the same kind of judgment. It's just as bad, just because of its destructive nature. Okay? And then he gives a few tips. He says, so if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, meaning you're headed to church, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your sacrifice to God. When you are on your way to court with your adversary, settle your differences quickly. Otherwise, your accuser may hand you over to the judge, who will hand you over to an officer, and you will be thrown into prison. And if that happens, you surely won't be free again until you've paid the last penny. What he's saying here is settle things quickly. Settle things quickly, as soon as humanly possible, when it is possible. Let's go ahead and just make a side note now, because we're all very much aware of this. There are some people that you are never going to be reconciled with. It's not your fault. It's just not going to happen. If you've apologized to somebody and they go, well, I refuse your apology, guess what? You've done every single thing that you're supposed to do. Okay? You don't need their permission for you to be forgiving. But what we're talking about here is when it can be, just two logical people in a room settling differences. If that's possible, that should be done. And that should be taken care of as quickly as possible. Then he goes into the very non-awkward subject of lust. So here we go. Verse 27. You've heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And let me just go ahead and state this very frankly. He's not just talking about women. I'm sorry, let me start that over. You can see how non-awkward this is. He's not just talking about men, he's talking about women as well. Okay? So, if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. I bet you can't wait for an explanation of that one. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. This, folks, is called hyperbole. In other words, an exaggerated statement to make a very important point. Okay? If we chopped off a body part every time we lusted, we'd all just be a bunch of torsos hopping around, barely getting anything done. Just, hold the door for me. I can't hold it either. I mean, it's just, we would all, So he's trying to make an important point that this is destructive. And so it must be dealt with quickly, decisively, and severely if necessary. I've talked to certain families, and we always look at them like they've lost their mind. But, I know some people that are just like, we don't have a TV in the house. We've just got rid of it. And we all think, what do you point your furniture at? Just what is... But we know that it's bringing things into their home that they don't want. I know people that have gotten rid of their internet. They've severed that completely from their life. And that usually doesn't take a whole lot of explanation either. It's letting things into their home that they don't want. And that's a very difficult thing to sacrifice, especially in our day and age, but they found it worth it. They have to do this just because of things that they've run into in the past. All right? So that's what he's talking about, that we must be quick, decisive, and severe when it comes to dealing with temptation. So there's several things that kind of overlap these two passages that I want to discuss with you, and why our thoughts can be just as destructive as our actions. And the first thing that we can see from this is there are no victimless sins. There are no victimless sins. And when I hear that, I have to admit it drives me a little bit nuts. I hear people, pundits, newscasters, people in the entertainment industry, it's just a harmless thing. It's a victimless action. And yet, if God says this is bad, what that means, how you interpret that is this is bad, pure and simple. And there are no victimless sins. Here's the thing: God's laws for us. Okay, his rules to live by. He didn't just pick them out of thin air. These are expressions and extensions of his very nature. You've heard Steve talk about this. You're going to hear him talk about it again, and you're going to hear me talk about it now. They are an extension of his nature. God does not want us to lie. He wants us to tell the truth because he is truth. God wants us to love all other people because he is love. He wants us to not hate people because people are made in his image. These guidelines are expressions of himself. And when we violate one of these through sin, we are violating God's nature. And so if he comes along and says, this guy, God, who created the world, the universe, and us in it, and knows how it operates, and says, don't do this, that means it's something that we should not do. They're finding, talking about anger for a moment, they're finding that anger is, and resentment, and I'm not just talking about, your favorite sports team loses a game, and I'm talking about that resentment, that lingering hatred that just kind of eats away, that just kind of boils down into this giant blob of absolute hatred for another human being that we just hold on to for a very long time. That kind of resentment and anger really eats at a human being. And what they find is that the vast majority of people that are in the hospital are there, and that their illness is very often, unless it's something like a car accident or something along those lines, they are related to something that has been caused because of stress, fear, or worry, or a combination of all three. And this will lift your spirits. We all have cancer. Did you know that? Every single one of us produces cancer cells every single day. But we have an immune system, and it comes in and it scoops all that up. Before they can mature or take hold, it comes in, grabs all those, gets rid of them, and we go along our merry way. But our stress or anger inhibits our immune system. And they're finding that the root of cancer is not eating eggs or sweet and low, it's the fact that we are not taking care of these residual chunks of hatred or stress or worry, and they cause us to become more ill. Because our thoughts can be just as destructive as our actions. And when it comes to lust, and I've actually tried to find articles that would tell me some of this stuff. All I know is that when it comes to pornography on the internet, there is a lot. They all agree on that one. And there are people that will tell you that it's perfectly healthy, it's perfectly fine. We've got the statistics to prove that it's A-okay. And if you talk to counselors, if you talk to people that are trying to save marriages, they will tell you a different story. They will tell you stories of depression. They will tell you stories of just a lack of happiness with life. They will talk to you about stories of just utter loneliness. And they paint a very different picture because they know that your thoughts can be just as destructive as your actions. And so we have to be very, very careful about what we allow to linger in us. We all get angry. We all struggle with lust. I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was Sanders, Oswald Chambers. I don't know. One of those guys, we hear that name like, yeah, he was a Christian. He was a good guy. Anyway, he said, you can't keep birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from making a nest in your hair. We have to make sure that as certain thoughts enter into our thinking, that we take hold of them and remove them. We have to make sure that we are constantly working on that. And yes, it is constant. It is a forever thing. I wish that I could tell you that one day you're going to grow up, you're going to hit about 65, and all of these temptations it'll be like a reward for hitting your 60s. They'll just all go away. Nope, that's not what happens. And it's just something that is just a constant struggle. And so we must be vigilant in this and constantly stay on it. The other thing we see is this. We must pursue integrity, not legalism. We must pursue integrity and not legalism. You see, the Pharisees loved their rules, and they loved finding out what it was that they should not do, but also what they could do. There's living life in such a way where you try to hold to God's standards as keenly and crisply and sharply as you can, and then there's the attitude of, well, I see what I can't do, so that maps out what I can do, and so that's where I get to play. And that was them to a T. That's what legalism does. In fact, there's a story where they were trying to catch Jesus again, and one of them says, what's the greatest commandment? And we're actually going to talk about this a little bit more during the next point, but he says, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, you read the scriptures, what does it say? And it says, love God and love others. And Jesus said, that's right, go and love your neighbor, go and do likewise. And then the man says, but who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That's legalism. That's, okay, so I'll take care of these guys. I'll consider them my neighbors. But this guy, do I have to consider him my neighbor? Legalism asks, how close to the barrier can I get? And if I slip over, well, there's a great story of some people being asked to be a chauffeur, and so they were being vetted, trying to see who would do the best job. Obviously, this is a job where you need to take care of not only a person, but a car and some other things. And so they brought them in and they said, look, on the driveway, right next to it, there's a wall. So we're curious, how close do you think you could get to that wall without touching it? And the first guy said, I bet I could get within around a foot to that wall. Not touch it, car would be okay. They bring in the next guy and they ask him all the questions. And then they ask him, how close to that wall do you think you could get without touching it? And he said, I'm going to say about 6 inches. I get within 6 inches of that wall and your car will be just fine. Third guy, all the other questions, and then they asked him, how close to that wall do you think you could get? And he goes, honestly, I would try to stay as far away from the wall as I possibly could. He got hired. It's not about how close to sin that we can get without getting burned. It's about living for the Lord. It's about striving to live under the standards for our benefit, the benefit of others, and for the glory of God. pursue integrity, pursue character, not legalism. Okay? And the last one is this. We must love God and love others. We are to love God and to love others. That one statement stands in contradiction to everything Jesus described in those verses about anger and lust. In fact, the verse that I quoted just a moment ago, Matthew 36. Matthew 22, starting at verse 36. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. You see, the Pharisees loved to discuss the law ad nauseum. They would talk about it for hours, and they would talk about it in such a way, like they would take all 613 rules from the Old Testament, and they would say, okay, well, what's the most important? What's the second? What's the third? And they would put that list all in order of importance. So if there was a debate, well, number 592 and number 591, we may need to switch those up. I mean, they would literally discuss this for hours. And that wasn't all. What happened over the first 3 centuries is that they would take the Old Testament, and around the 3rd century A.D., they took there was a book that was put together called the Mishnah, and basically it was an interpretation of the Old Testament, and it had all of these interpretations of everything that it said, and then they decided later, hey, let's do some interpretations of the interpretations. And they took that, and those were called the Talmuds. And there's a Jerusalem Talmud that is about 12 volumes in length, and there's a Babylonian Talmud that is 60 volumes in length. And they would spend all of this time discussing all of these things, and it's something that we see even out throughout history. But it's something that they would do, and they would just constantly argue about these things. And Jesus just brought it all down to one simple statement. And he said, it's not about measuring and finding out which one is more important than the other. Love God and love others. Love God and love others. And make sure that that is what guides you in everything that you do. One of the things that, how every now and again there's a truth, and it's true, it's the truth, but somebody comes along and they state it in such a way where it just resonates. And it's something that just kind of sticks to your psyche for the rest of your life. And I heard somebody say this, and it's something that I have always remembered and something I try to apply to my life. And they basically said that it's a lot harder to be angry at someone when you know their story. It's a lot harder to be angry at someone when you know their story. And that is something that, of course, I've run into many times in ministry. I run into people, and you kind of wonder, good grief, what is going on with this person? Are they, there's something not quite, they're not centered right. What is going on? And you begin to hear their story. And you find out about what's going on at work, and how there may be a boss there that's trying to get rid of them, and they're going to lose their sole source of income. Or maybe we find out that there's something going on at home, or maybe there's something going on with their children, or there's something going on here or there, maybe financially, maybe physically, and the list goes on. And when you find out what their story is, it's a lot harder to be judgmental. It's a lot harder to put ourselves here while we look at them and put them here. And the reason that we need to understand this, the reason that we need to know this, is because That's what church is all about. I don't know about you, but I need all the grace I can get. I need all the grace that God will give me. And I'm pretty sure everybody else does too. And if I'm going to look at people the way that God looks at me, if I am going to show people the same amount of grace that He has shown me, well, that's pretty much an infinite amount of grace. I need to make sure that I am loving God and loving others and approaching them in such a way that I see people the way that God sees them. And let's go ahead and be really frank, that's hard. That's very difficult. It's not easy to do. Something else that we discussed in the connection group is how there are, there's that there is all kinds of people that irritate us. There are people that are whiners, or maybe they just don't get it, or people that are prideful and boastful, or people that just think they're the center of the universe, or people that, and Jesus dealt with every single one of them. And if Jesus can deal with them, so can we. And that's vital. That is absolutely vital if we are going to be a church that serves and does ministry. If we're going to be helping people. Folks, without that grace, without that love, ministry becomes very difficult and very messy very quickly. One of the things that I want very much for you to realize is that Steve's going to be preaching longer when he comes back. That's the first thing you need to realize as I start wrapping up. But also, there's a question that we must be consistently asking ourselves. Am I growing in my love for God and in my love for others? Am I growing in my love for God and in my love for others? And am I allowing that? Am I allowing that to move me in the direction that I need to be going when it comes to serving, when it comes to doing God's will, when it comes to simply living the life that God has called me to live? I'm going to go ahead and ask the worship team to come on up. I want to remind you that we have our communion station. We have one in the front and one in the back. If you'd like to take communion this morning. We also have our cross right over here if you would like to spend some time in prayer. And we have people over there that will pray with you, should you so choose. Okay, it's up to you. We also have our blue bag ministry. These blue bags, there's some on each end of the stage, and there's some in the back as well. If you pick up one of these blue bags, you're saying that I'm ready to accept Christ as my Savior, and somebody will see that. They will come alongside you, and they will explain to you in very simple terms what it means to accept Christ. It'll take about 7 or 8 minutes of your time, okay? But are we willing to ask ourselves that question? Are we willing to see people? And let's be even more honest, to strive to see people the way that God sees them. So that's those two questions that I want you to pray about. Am I loving God more on a day-by-day basis? And am I loving others more as well?